Sarah, since we first talked to Chris, probably maybe 2 months ago, I have really been looking forward to having him on the podcast with us. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm really excited to bring in our next guest for everybody. Excited is probably the wrong word as we're talking about disaster recovery in the wake of Hurricane Helene, but to find people that can give their expertise and who have lived through it and seen to the other side. So I'm looking forward to the conversation. Really excited to bring Chris Hoffman in and to join us. Let's see how it goes. Welcome to Connections, the podcast from addiction professionals of North Carolina, where we explore the nuances of addiction and mental health through the lens of policy and practice.
We're your hosts,
Sara Howe
and Morgan Coiner, and we're here to help you see how it all connects.
Today we have a special guest and a special topic. In the aftermath of Hurricane Helene that hit Western North Carolina at the end of September, many groups were working on what they can do to assist. APNC is not unlike many organizations that work to help their friends and neighbors out west and to determine what can be done. In the process, we were really fortunate. We were able to deliver water and vital supplies such as naloxone, medication lockboxes, first aid kits, etc., immediately to the region. But we wanted to do more. We wanted to figure out what else can be done and what has been done in the face of natural disasters for the behavioral health field. To that end, we sought out experts who have either been experts because that was their area, or in the case of our guest today, had to become an expert really quick in the face of a natural disaster. And with that, we're really excited to welcome Chris Hoffman from the state of Iowa. He got educated at the University of Iowa, so a fellow Big Ten graduate. He has been in the behavioral health space for over 40 years. And as we said, because he had to suddenly become an expert in natural disasters in the wake of devastating tornadoes that hit Iowa a few years back, Chris has learned what to do, what to expect, because this is a long-term recovery. So with that, Chris, thank you for your time and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sarah, for that really nice introduction.
You're welcome. We're so thrilled to have you and grateful for you willing to talk about your expertise and bring up what is ultimately a traumatic experience for you and for those that were in your community. So if you could tell us just a little bit about that story. Tell us about what happened in Iowa and where you were at the time and what you needed to think about immediately at that point.
Well, I live in Waterloo, Iowa, which is northeast Iowa. If you know John Deere, that's Waterloo is John Deere. That's where it started. So the big green things running around out in the fields make the tractors here and so forth. So that's probably our biggest employer. And the way I ended up learning more about disaster response for behavioral health than I ever thought I would happened in 2008. In 2008, we had essentially two disasters. We had a fast disaster, which was tornadoes. Tornadoes came into what's Butler County, we're in Blackhawk. Butler's just outside of Blackhawk. And it hit Applington, Parkersburg town and swiped a little bit of the Dike, New Hartford area. And then it walked all the way across the northern side of Blackhawk County on over into Buchanan County on east. And the significance for me was I grew up that side of the county, and lots of friends and relatives got impacted by those tornadoes. And then I get a call from Department of Human Services. Hey, we need somebody to do a behavioral health response to the tornadoes. You up for it? I'm like, well, okay. I owe it to the people I know. And so we get that going a little bit. And then about 2 weeks later, we had a slow disaster. I call it a slow disaster because it was a slow flood. Up north, Minnesota and so forth, there was a lot of rain that year, and the Cedar River started coming up, and it came up, and everybody knew it was coming up, and so they started frantically moving everybody. My business manager took a day off to go canoe to a friend's house back and forth to get the stuff out of their house before it was underwater, and that moved on down to Cedar Rapids, southeast of here, and it actually hit Cedar Rapids a little harder than it hit Waterloo, Cedar Falls. And so now we had a disaster that covered multiple counties. And I get a call and says, well, you started already. You want to do a few more counties? I'm like, well, okay, we'll figure it out here. We ended up covering 8 counties, stretched, if you get a map out sometime, all the way from Mason City. If you ever heard of the Music Man, that's where Mason City came from. All the way over to Independence, Iowa, which is Buchanan County, and all the counties in between there. And because everybody'd gotten flooded or tornadoed one way or the other in those counties. So we had to put together a behavioral health response team out of that. And quite honestly, Iowa, I don't know if it hadn't really done that before, but they wanted me to do it. There wasn't much guidance, so I just went out to the FEMA website and read how to put together a FEMA response funded disaster response team. And
super easy to do, navigating a FEMA website. So
yeah, well, I actually found the definitions and everything. It was pretty clear. So what you end up needing to do with a disaster response of any type, because we later ended up doing one for COVID also, which was a whole different kettle of fish. It was more kid adult focused in that lots of events to kind of keep people put together. But the bottom line came down to we needed to be able to seek out families and anybody that had been impacted by the natural disasters and kind of survey and see who was struggling with behavioral health issues. And when doing that, the important thing was, to me, is you had to put together a team of people who knew their community and who people would talk to, okay? Because we had the first few weeks to a month, Red Cross was there running around, and we had some of our behavioral health staff were out and about because we had offices in many of the towns that had been impacted, making a presence there. But the behavioral health response was lacking organization at that point, which seems to be how it works often. So I ended up, luckily, being from the area, I put together ended up being 2 teams. I stood the whole program up in 30 days. And
wow.
Like one of the people I hired was, I'd known him since I was a kid. He was a friend of my parents. He'd been on the ambulance crew back home in Dunkerton, and he was a farmer. So he could walk onto the farms and they would talk to him. So he even got in and talked to the Amish, and I tried to do that for years and failed at it, but he bought enough pigs and stuff from them over the years. He was able to they talked to him. They knew him.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how we approached the whole project, was hiring. I never hired people so fast in my life as I did for that deal. Like, you walk in, if you had a reference on your resume of any one person you knew that I knew, I just hired you. It was hardly even an interview process, and we did okay with that. So that's my experience. That's how we stood it up. Questions about any of that so far?
I would love for you, you talked about standing that up in 30 days, which is impressive. But in those 30 days, people were in need of many things. And I think what we're seeing here, is, after that 30 days, a lot of people kind of go back to business as usual. And the understanding that there are still really great needs can start to dissipate. And so I wonder, like, I imagine you saw something similar, and how were you able to, take the time you needed to get the team up and running, but also hit the ground running to start addressing things quickly?
Well, we deployed our staff as well as we could. Um, Keeping in mind, all my clinicians already had caseloads anyway, so I couldn't just arbitrarily
Right.
cancel appointments. Nobody promised to pay. So, we took a bit of a risk and deployed some people on, hoping I could talk people into paying us for it later. That didn't work out so well, but it is what it is. So that first 30 days, we were just kind of winging it with some state folks being really good cheerleaders and encouraging it. But it put us in a position to then do the longer project, which lasted about 18 months. But it seems to me, here's the phases of particularly the early parts of disasters, because I don't know if you heard about the derecho that Cedar Rapids had with the hurricane winds came through and knocked almost down every tree and so forth in Cedar Rapids. But it kind of went through the same process here. In that first 2 weeks to 30 days, you're going through the holy smoke phase of, look, what's happened? What are we going to do? And so what happens is all the adults start focusing on getting a tarp on their roof and talking to FEMA or talking to their insurance agent, possibly farming the kids out to grandma and grandpa because their house didn't get hit because they don't live here, and all those things. So they go through that whole phase of, Maslow's hierarchy there, shelter and food and all that. They're getting all that organized. After that first 30 days of doing that, the adrenaline rush is kind of going off. And by then, if anybody's been killed, they've probably been buried. So they're past the funeral arrangements on top of everything else. But then the grieving starts, or the reality of what has been lost starts to set in. And that's when your behavioral health folks need to hopefully be on the ground and talking to people and doing their surveys. I remember one person, we'd heard that they were sitting down by the Cedar River like they were going to jump in, and they were. And
Wow.
Our staff caught wind if it went down there, and they did prevent that suicide. So
That's amazing.
yeah, it was.
Wow.
I haven't thought about some of this stuff for a while. So we did a lot of that. Am I answering your question, Sarah?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. And then it kind of starts moving into the now what phase. How do we got to pick some corn. We got to get all the stuff out of the fields. All those things start happening over the next 3 to 6 months. But when the next phase that people need to really be thinking about, and I keep thinking about you folks in North Carolina right now, is the holiday phase. If you've been flooded or tornadoed or etc., and all of a sudden you go to set up your Christmas tree and you find out all those things that your kids made are gone, and families have a real hard time with that, particularly the kids. So that's that phase. You get them everybody through the holidays, and then it gets cold. And I had to have that's when my team started breaking down.
Yeah.
And they started fighting with each other, and we had to have a real serious conversation about, you guys actually do like each other. Let's get through the winter here. And they did. Then it moved on into spring, and the teams started getting smaller because I'll call them my paraprofessional folks started dropping off for lots of reasons. And I had two clinicians. I had two teams, a North team and a South time team, and my two master's level social work folks ran the two different teams, and they became more in demand along with my other more clinical people at that point. But we kept going all the way through the summer. And what we transitioned to after, and it started happening around the holidays actually, is a real big focus on the kids. Because think about it, if you're an adult and you're focusing on your Maslow's hierarchy of needs stuff, you're likely forgetting to talk to your kids. And that's what we found was happening. So as the kids didn't get it, particularly, the under 7-year-old crowd, they didn't understand. Was it going to happen again and so forth? So we did a hardcore push to work with school districts and families to have conversations directly with the kids and encourage families to let us know if there's issues going on. We were discovering 6 months later, their 7-year-olds were still wanting to sleep in mom and dad's room because they're afraid. They were afraid a tornado was going to come again. Okay. So we got coloring books and all kinds of stuff organized and started doing stuff in the schools, and we did a camp, more than one actually, I think, where they'd come in for a day and color pictures, how the tornado impact you, how the flood impact you, do some art. I had an art therapy staff member that this was her real thing. They did a lot of stuff with that. And sometimes, when you're the administrator, you kind of wonder, is that really going to do anything? I got to talking to my neighbor, and I did not realize his grandkids were all out in New Hartford, and they had gone to that camp. And he was so happy about it. You don't usually hear that directly. But we were glad we got kids sleeping in their own beds. We started getting them prepared for, the sirens are going to go off again, guys. It's coming spring. The weather sirens are going to go off. There's no reason to panic,
Mm-hmm.
You got to be thinking through all of those things that are going to impact kids, and trying to get your adults in as you survey them and kind of identify their needs, but they're not going to be as forthcoming as the kids are about what they're scared about. But sometimes you ended up with families talking more to you because it was okay if the kid was scared, but the dad wasn't going to admit it.
So I'm wondering, Chris, there's so many different facets of this, right? Like you said, there's the immediate aftershock, there's the grief, there's the trauma individually, and that hits a community. And then there's that long term, and we're sort of in that medium phase, right? We're a few months out. It is cold. It is that time of the year where we do think about holidays. There's so many different pieces. And how did you or your team determine, what to do first, what to do next for our members that are out there right now? I'd love to give them some just recommendations on, okay, here's where you are in this medium phase, and here's how we triaged it, what we looked at, and how we prepared for that next longer term phase.
See, you have a challenge in North Carolina that, as best I can tell, the state never accessed dollars to set up organized teams. So each organization is going to have to decide, first of all, what's their capacity to respond. And everybody's going to want to respond. As an administrator, I'm going to encourage you to be real careful with that, because if you're going to sit around and wait for people to feel grateful and put some money on the table, in my experience, not a lot of that's going to happen. And you still want to have an organization left once the worst of the disaster is gone. And I know that may sound kind of harsh, but that's the reality of having to run an organization. So your next step in is sit down with whoever your management team is and say, what can we do? What do we want to do? What are we equipped to do? And then put together your plan. If you have a lot of adults coming through your organization, you can always survey them and ask them, did you get impacted by this? Do you have a place to live? Is your house livable, or is it full of mold? Or try to identify those, what's the proper word for that now? Social determinants of health.
Right. Yep.
Look through that hierarchy with them, do that kind of a deal, and see where they're at. They can come in and talk to you all the time, but if you never ask them those things, a lot of people are too proud to tell you.
Yeah,
but if you have,
yeah, because you might be asking about their general, let's talk about your substance use disorder, let's talk about that process, and not back.
How'd you get through the flood? Just don't beat them over the head with it, but make sure it's being talked about, because if they've recently lost somebody or something and now they got an OWI, maybe after even the funeral. I'm sorry, I've been in the substance use business a long time. They're probably not going to want to. They're probably not putting two and two together that way. Right. It doesn't hurt to ask, and if nothing's wrong with that way, then it is. You move on. Focus on the kids. The kids are the ones that get the shortest end of the stick out of this, because mom and dad may think, well, you're fed, we got a roof, and the furnace is working. What's your problem? And they've never talked to them about it, or they sent them off to live with grandma and grandpa were mean as hell, and they had to put up with that for a couple months, or they're missing a classmate that got drowned.
Right. Yeah, Morgan and I were in Western North Carolina just a couple weeks ago, and there were areas that looked completely normal, depending, and then there were areas, which I'm sure you saw with tornadoes, which take weird paths too. There were areas that were just devastated, and so driving through those areas brings trauma back. Immediately you can see it, let alone living it and then tending to the needs of the behavioral health needs of that community. It also, the other piece I wanted to really get into, we have about 10 minutes left, so I wanted to make sure we get into this, is taking care of your staff and what they've gone through themselves and what they start to see. And I will tell you, I was at a meeting with our secretary and several other players in this space. And one of them does a lot of work in the foster care system. And they were actually trying to find some of the families that had foster children. And the woman on the phone was talking to her, and she said, I'm really sorry, you're going to have to hold on. They're pulling a body out of a tree in my backyard right now. And she said, nobody's talking to her about what she's seeing, right? As a staff member, hearing that, addressing that. So how do you do that? What recommendations do you have for our members?
Well, this is the first thing you need to have as an executive director. You need to have one or two staff like I did who reminded me to be nice. They would. And so we would do, not like big group therapy things or anything, but we'd frequently get the community would actually donate food, and we had a big barbecue. If you have an EAP, make sure everybody knows that the EAP is available to everybody if you don't have it that way, but staff are comfortable talking to some of the other clinicians or somebody about it. That's another option that you can pursue. But the big thing is to bring it up and tell staff, if you've been exposed to this stuff, it doesn't hurt to talk to somebody, because you know how people are. They may think, I didn't have anything happen to me. What's my problem? Well, it's continuous exposure to those things can bother you. That's one way to do it. The other thing is if you're the director of the organization, your job, from my perspective, is to deal with the bureaucracy of what's going on with all that stuff, so that your staff does not have to worry about if they're out in the field. If somebody in the Capitol is unhappy with your agency, or Red Cross is fussing at you about something, that's your job, is to take care of all that stuff, to clear the path for them to be out there. So that's all that they have to worry about. I know as a director, sometimes you want to get out there and make your presence known. Everybody knows you cared. But quite honestly, if you want to get people seen and you want your staff not to have to worry about all the extra details, you need to be clearing the path for them so they don't have to worry about that. I think that also keeps healthier staff. I'm also a big believer in everybody knows the hierarchy. If they need to talk about something, they need to know how to do that. And I would often say, if my door's open, come in, I can probably talk to you. If my door's shut, you can't. And I didn't make it any harder than that. And so people would, on occasion, come in. It was usually scuffles they were having with each other more than anything else. But you just got to keep on top of it and make sure they have avenues to resolve whatever issues they may have going on. And know those people as well as you can. I had one lady that she was the only one I let go out of the whole bunch. After I hired her, I found out she'd had a son who got murdered. And she kept telling people about it when she would go out to their houses, and we just couldn't have that. That's another way you got to watch your staff. If they're getting overwhelmed and doing stuff like that, you don't have the time to let them keep doing that till they get better, because you're going to impact too many people. You kind of got to catch them and move them on before they do that anymore. Am I answering your question?
Yeah, I think so. And I don't want to monopolize, Morgan, if you had some questions.
No, you're totally fine. I mean, I was just thinking, like, I appreciate the way you kind of talk about the gravity of this. I think something that also happens as, you know, the disaster incident gets farther and farther in the past is this idea of like, okay, well, we have to keep going, so we keep going. And like, no matter how you were impacted, sometimes you can't just keep going. And there's things to wrestle with around that. And so I appreciate just how you talk about it sort of with the weight that it deserves, because I think a lot of people listening to this are going to feel very validated, because they are still feeling, you know, for lack of a better term, big feelings about it. That hasn't gone away. And so I appreciate sort of how you're handling the conversation about it.
Well, one of the amazing things was the generosity of the people that responded. I think every church group has a mobile, we'll come and fix your house group.
Yeah.
For lack of a better word, you know, the Baptists had one, Methodists had one, Catholics, Jewish folks, everybody had one. And you can also turn to your 12-step communities, because they will oftentimes have a pretty active bunch that if they know somebody else in the 12-step community that needs their house sheetrocked, a group of them will get together and they'll just do it. So knowing those resources and who you can count on there is something else. Organizations, if they don't have that in their back pocket, now's the time to learn. So
I did want to make sure everybody knows that the state does have a hurricane hotline under its Hope for NC. So it's Hope, the number 4, and then NC. We'll make sure to throw that up there and get that link out. But like Chris said, I don't believe that we engaged in having specific teams, like on the ground teams that they funded, but they did have a state response. So I want to make sure everybody knew about that. I think in just the closing minutes, I mean, you brought up quite a few different things. I think the kids, to me, the biggest thing, and you've said this to me before, Chris, that not ignoring the needs of our youth. And I'm really thinking about our prevention staff who sit on the front lines. We don't consider them, quote, clinical, right? They're not doing direct treatment. They're not necessarily intervening, but they are the eyes and ears in a school and in a community for referring and getting that problem identification and referral. And just earlier this week, we did a session on trauma and grief with our prevention teams around the state, because they had come to us and said, we've got some things we want to talk about, and this is not our area of expertise at all. So I think it's really important to remember the full continuum and where everybody is seeing somebody who needs help. It's not necessarily just walking through the door and raising your hand at a treatment center. It's the whole community.
It has to be.
Mm-hmm.
And kids will be the piece of that will help break down some of the other barriers, because people do what they need to do to help their kids.
Yep, they sure do.
I think like kids take their cues from us. So if we're pretending that we're not scared, if we're pretending that everything's fine and back to normal, they're going to do the same thing. And we know that that creates a lot of, unhealthy habits that so many of us are trying to unlearn as adults. Mm-hmm. And so if we, Sara and I talk about this all the time, like if we can create a generation of kids mm-hmm. who know how to regulate their emotions and cope with hard things and know that there are resources available, we are looking at a very different future. And I hope that that's what's going to happen in Western North Carolina, is that those kids are going to get that support. So that, over the next few years, like they become, the future community members that keep the community together, and sort of in the wake of this.
Yeah, I think about, I lived in Waco, Texas for almost 11 years. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Giant, mm-hmm. but there's a scene in there where they're up in Dallas and it's big storms coming. They talk about there's a tornado coming up from Waco. Mm-hmm. Well, I found out the story behind that in 1957 on May 11th. There was a bad tornado in Waco. It knocked down most of the downtown and so forth. And I knew people that got anxious every May 11th.
Oh, wow.
And I lived there from 88 to 98. Wow. So it was that stuff stays with people.
Mm-hmm. It does.
So.
It's buried almost into the fabric of your DNA.
Yeah, because man, if it was cloudy that day, ooh,
right.
People get nervous, So.
Yeah. Well, Chris, that is a whole other podcast, by the way, in terms of a trauma response in Waco, because you lived during another very.
Oh yeah, I was there for that whole show.
Yeah, and trauma and grief and everything that happens in a community. That is a whole other podcast we might have to chat with you about. But we're really, really grateful that one, you're reliving a little bit of this trauma, and I acknowledge that.
Yeah.
Appreciate your willingness to do that for the good of the cause.
I didn't know that was going to happen, but yeah.
Yes, and we're grateful that you're willing to do that, to help our friends and neighbors in the West, in Western North Carolina, and just grateful for your expertise. Albeit you probably never wanted it, but
it wasn't something I had planned on.
Right, exactly. Is there anything in our final seconds that you want to share or say for our listeners?
No, just remember the kids, talk to them. If you don't know what to talk to them about, find somebody that knows how to talk to your kids. Don't just assume they're going to be okay, and just get ready for your holidays, because something will pop up that you don't expect.
Well said. Well, Chris, thank you for your time today, for sharing with us, and really just helping us as we navigate this disaster relief effort.
Good luck.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris.
Wow. So, what a conversation. There's so many things to take away from what Chris said. Although I think, as he said it repeatedly, let's not forget the kids. If there's anything we learned from this conversation, we are creating that next generation, and we cannot forget the impact of these singular events that can impact their entire life. What did you take away, Morgan?
Yeah, I mean, I think very similar, right? Like, I think there's something that innately in us when we hear about kids struggling, we want to help. And so to hear that his experience is that the kids are the ones who are forgotten, I think is really alarming and makes us really consider what we are doing and how we are handling kids' response to the hurricane and how they're going to carry that response the rest of their lives. And so it's a heavy thing, and I don't think, any parents really take it lightly. And so I'm glad that we could bring someone on to just remind them of the responsibility that they have, but also like that is possible and there are resources to help them do it.
Yeah, and I think finally, as we close this out, we struggled to figure out what to do in the aftermath, and we're a few months out, and there is still an aftermath. And to remind everybody, it is okay to not be okay, and it is okay to reach out for help, even within your own teams. Your own staff are still seeing this, living it every day. So where we can be a support as your association, we want to be here. We're not going away. We're still going to continue the conversation. This is just one of many opportunities for us to think about what can be done to support our communities, our friends and neighbors in the West as they recover from this devastating hurricane.